James.
اسمع انا رح اطلع الساعة 4
هلا اجاني الايميل تبعك
بس يمكن يلغوا لي الشيء فيمكن استنى.
طيب يا ريت ممتاز.
Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. Marhaba. Welcome. Good to see you. Really a pleasure for us to have this gathering today. I'm really very happy and delighted to have Joseph with us at UC Berkeley. If you actually just on a personal level, we live almost across the valley from each other in Amman. His family and my cousins used to be neighbors. And I said to Joseph that most likely we played soccer together without knowing each other. And I'm trying to see maybe who fouled me on the soccer field, and maybe it's Joseph. But we have a relationship that extends both from family in Jordan and in here. Joseph is very well known as really a living intellectual that contributes in so many different ways. If you follow some of the writings of Middle East Eye, you see his articles that are often responding and really providing a window and a view to what is taking place in the Middle East, the Arab and Muslim world. But this is not the content of this talk. This is just in terms of people to know some of the background. So Professor Joseph Massad is a professor of modern Arab politics and intellectual history at Columbia University. He is the author of several books, dozens of scholarly articles, and hundreds of op-eds. So if you are a student of the Middle East and student of the Arab and Muslim world, you have to read Colonial Effects, The Making of National Identity in Jordan, The Persistence of the Palestinian Question, Desiring Arabs, and Islam in Liberalism. So for students, I know you're able to go on Amazon immediately and purchase these books. I'm always encouraging people that one way to support the intellectual productions of individuals, scholars, and professors who work on the area while actually knowing the language of the area, because often people have specialization without knowing, you need to order these books and make sure to put them on your reading list. Now his new book, The Age of Independence, A Global History of Settler-Colonialism, is forthcoming from Princeton University Press. We were talking a few minutes ago, and he said it's going to be a 1,000-page book. And it will be out hopefully in the fall, next year. Next year. So I know I'm going to assign some of those pages for my courses, especially on Middle East, post-colonialism, refugee and immigrant crisis. So it will do both purposes if you carry it. It will be a workout, but also have a rich content in there. He's a recipient of a number of research and teaching awards, including the Lionel Trilling Book Award for his book Desiring Arabs, the Scott Nearing Award for Courageous Scholarship, and the Columbia University Faculty Mentoring Awards. His works have been translated to more than a dozen languages, including Arabic, Turkish, Chinese, Persian, French, Italian, Spanish, Dutch, Swedish, Japanese, German, and Indonesian. So we could do a multiple choice quiz with all of the languages being included. Professor Massad is also a regular columnist in English and Arabic at the London-based publication Middle East Eye and Arabic Eye 21. So it's a pleasure and an honor to have Professor Joseph Massad with us, and please help me welcome Professor Joseph Massad.
Well, I've actually written on the history of football, of soccer, but I used to hate the game, so we certainly did not play soccer, but something else perhaps. Basketball. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for coming on this lovely afternoon. And much warmer day than we have in New York. All right, the title also of today's lecture is The Age of Independence. It will try to give you an idea about this sort of big volume yes, Princeton calls it a doorstopper. It was supposed to be multiple volumes, but the publisher insisted that it should be just one, saying usually multiple volume books, people just sell the first volume and not volume 2 or 3. So they insisted on having just one. So in any case, I'm very happy to be here. And thank you, Hatem, all the sponsors. One of the most remarkable aspects of the independence of states that remains ignored, elided, downplayed, and evaded in scholarly research is the white supremacist settler-colonial origins of the very notion of a state's independence. It was the establishment of the first white supremacist European colonial settler state in 1776 by white colonists in what became the United States that inaugurated the Age of Independence, a trajectory that ends with the unilateral Declaration of Independence by the European colonial settlers of Rhodesia on the 11th of November 1965. Indeed, the last white supremacist Declaration of Independence of Rhodesia's colonial settlers pays homage to the first in borrowing their North American counterparts' exact words to declare their own independence from the same mother country. The connection between the two independent white supremacist colonial settler states was not lost on the British mother country. In 1963, the government of British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, or Macmillan's Conservative Party, prepared contingency plans for intervening in Rhodesia to prevent a potential unilateral independence. The secret file containing the relevant British documents was titled the Boston Tea Party. The secession and subsequent independence of Europe's white colonists in the settler colonies of the Americas, Asia, Africa, and Oceania takes place during the almost 2 centuries that separate the independence of the first and last white supremacist colonial settler states. During this period and after, independence would become the political goal of the natives of Europe's colonies and settler colonies, both within Europe and across the globe. But if the 19th century ushered in the independence of North, Central, and South American and Caribbean settler colonies, and some of the Oceanian and African settler colonies, and the Christian European provinces of the Ottoman Empire, the momentum of independence advanced more rapidly in the wake of World War I, both for the white colonial settlers of North America, Africa, and Oceania, as much as for the natives of Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. The pace became unstoppable after World War II. Aside from the independence of the European settler colonies of Israel and Rhodesia in 48 and 65, scores of European colonies, protectorates, and mandated territories obtained independence, ushering in the world of independent states across the globe. Since independence as a concept and political practice seems to equate the now independent countries, whether controlled by natives or colonial settlers, it simultaneously ends the era of formal colonialism and perpetuates and legitimates formal settler colonialism, recognizing both as in possession of sovereignty ratified by the latest global forum designed to grant such legitimacy, namely the United Nations. Yet, independence continues to be marketed by all these countries as a political good that ended the unjust rule of colonial powers in the case of the colonies and of the mother countries in the case of the settler colonies, even and especially if, in the case of the latter, it meant the continued subjugation of the indigenous peoples, from the First Nations of Canada and the Native Americans of the United States and the indigenous populations across Central and South America, to the Aborigines of Australia, the Palestinians, the Maoris, the Kanaks of New Caledonia, the Catholics of Northern Ireland, not least of all, of course, Black Southern Africans. and I mean by that South Africa, Namibia, Rhodesia, then Zimbabwe, and others. Whence arose this concept of independence? What was its historical and geographic trajectory? How did this white European settler colonial principle become also the goal of the colonized natives and the indigenous peoples of the world? That the formal independence of white English-speaking colonial settlers resulted in outcomes far different from the formal independence of the natives of Europe or Europe's colonies and that of the Spanish and Portuguese colonial settlers seemed to signal to many European and white American commentators less that the principle was invented to benefit mainly Europe's English-speaking colonial settlers from its inception, but the colonially predicted failure of natives and non-English settlers to manage their own affairs. In my lecture today, I trace some of the juridical, philosophical, and political histories of the concept and practice of independence in order to understand its global effects as the primary principle for the existence of the state system since the late 18th century, and how the concept of self-determination would join it during and after World War I as a corollary to institute white European colonial and settler colonial privileges over the indigenous peoples of the colonies. Most accounts of independence depict it as an outcome of the European Enlightenment and revolutionary thought, which is committed, we are told, to universal human equality and freedom. However, the genealogy of independence is entirely inseparable from the 18th century new ideology of white supremacy and settler colonialism, and that this deep co-foundationalism is what liberal Euro-American historians and theorists and their disciples need to forget, repress, and deny. Before the term independence came into existence and acquired political significance and legal status, other concepts were used to separate from or leave the control of a sovereign. The Dutch Act of Abjuration of 1581 is often referred to anachronistically to mean a declaration of independence, even though the Dutch term was in fact an enunciation of the sovereignty of King Philip II of Spain, in effect a secession, which itself is a 16th century English term, and did not posit notions of independence. Still, the coupling of the whiteness and Protestantism of the English-speaking settlers set them apart from all others in the course of the centuries to come, as they would be the only colonists or colonists to achieve both political and economic independence. The only two exceptions were the British-sponsored settler colonies of South Africa and its Dutch and English white Protestant colonists, and the European Jewish settler colony of Israel, whose colonial project was designed by British Protestant evangelicals. It is in the middle of the 18th century, in the latest literature on the law of nations, however, where the term is inaugurated and would soon acquire a juridical and a technical sense, referring to the status of a state in what becomes a society of nations. The ancient Roman notion of jus gentium, which was private law that dealt with relations among individuals within the Roman imperium and not with foreign relations, was adopted in the first half of the 17th century to different ends and endowed with different meaning by the Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius, inaugurating a new doctrine in juridical and political parlance, governing also relations between states. Jus gentium was translated but misapprehended in the 18th century as the law of nations, loi de gens, and later international law. Yet the basis of what becomes modern international law, as Anthony Angie demonstrated, was in fact created by the colonial encounter in the Americas in the 16th century through the major figure of Francisco de Vitoria, who is a precursor to Grotius, and wherein the question of civilized and barbarian nations, of defensive and aggressive wars, what later came to be known as just and unjust wars, were concretized and continue to inform the discipline through the present. However, the independence of states did not become part of this legal lexicon for another century. Thomas Hobbes uses it in 1651 in the Leviathan to refer to the different branches of a mixed monarchy which led to civil war in England. Hobbes offered a contrary view to Grotius and others' understanding of jus gentium, insisting on it being exclusively an affair between states and not between individuals. It took another century before the term indépendance in French, or independency and/or independence in English, begins to acquire a political meaning akin to what it would refer to by the last quarter of the 18th century. The term remained in flux in the 1740s and beyond, especially so as the Baron de Montesquieu himself did not use it in his 1748 Spirit of the Laws in this technical sense. In contrast to its later political signification, Montesquieu used the term in reference to an unconstrained individual, not governed by laws, or one who lived in a state of nature. He seemed to equate independence with, quote, unlimited freedom, which he insisted was not the same as liberty. This aside, Montesquieu does not apply the present to our minds the difference between independence and liberty. Liberty is a right of doing whatever the laws permit, and if a citizen could do what they forbid, he would be no longer possessed of liberty, because all of his fellow citizens would have the same power. In line with the reigning climatology of the times, Montesquieu worried that in warmer climates, bodies are more susceptible to vice, including in Muslim and Catholic European societies, as one would expect. It is in this context that he understands liberty as the sole endowment of Northern European Protestants. I quote you. When the Christian religion 2 centuries ago became unhappily divided into Catholic and Protestant, the people of the North embraced the Protestant, and those of the South adhered still to the Catholic. The reason is plain. The people of the North have, and will forever have, a spirit of liberty and independence, which the people of the South have not. It is in the German Christian von Wolff's 1749 book, The Law of Nations, published a year after Montesquieu's book, that we find the early transformation of the term independent into its later technical signification. Whereas there is no reference in the book to the independence of states, the adjective independent is used in relation to nations and peoples. It was a decade later that the Swiss Emmer de Vattel, a student of Wolff, uses the term in such a manner that instituted it as the new technical term that came to be known as the independence of a state. In his 1758 Le Droit de Gens, Vattel speaks of the independence of bishops and the church from political authority up to the 17th century, hence his notion that a state must be independent of religious authority and that indeed it has the right to determine the nature of public worship. In his magnum opus, Vattel mentions the state's independence of other states when he speaks of the ability of a state to, quote, discharge the duties she owes to herself and to her citizens. In his enumeration of the laws of nations, Vattel lists the liberty and independence of nations as his second general law, explaining that, quote, nations being free and independent of each other in the same manner as men are naturally free and independent. Unlike Montesquieu, who separated independence from liberty, Vattel couples the notions of liberty and independence throughout his treatise as if they were complements to one another, if not synonyms in an almost redundant manner. He adds that, quote, after having established the position that foreign nations have no right to interfere in the government of an independent state, it is not difficult to prove that the latter has a right to oppose such interference. To govern herself according to her own pleasure is a necessary part of her independence. The question of settler colonialism is paramount in the mind and thought of Vattel, which may explain his later popularity among the white colonists and their descendants in the 13 British colonies of North America. In the tradition of John Locke and other liberal political theorists, Vattel was intent on justifying white European colonization of the lands of non-Europeans and registering his support of settler colonists, though he was more discriminatory than others in not granting legitimacy to all settler colonization. Let me quote: "Those who still pursue this idle mode of life usurp more extensive territories than, with a reasonable share of labor, they would have occasion for, and have therefore no reason to complain if other nations, more industrious and too closely confined, come to take possession of part of those lands. Thus, though the conquest of the civilized empires of Peru and Mexico was a notorious usurpation, the establishment might, under confining themselves within just bounds, be extremely lawful. The people of those extensive tracts rather ranged through than inhabited them." This is not, of course, much unlike Thomas More's early justification of settler colonialism in his classic Utopia, published in 1516 on the morrow of the conquest of the Americas, 2.5 centuries before Vattel's book, where More, even long before John Locke's justifications, addressed the laws that colonists should impose on the inhabitants of uncultivated land that the colonists covet for themselves. Vattel's notion of independence also applies to property-owning and non-laboring individuals. He tells us that, quote, "An independent individual, whether he has been driven from his country or has legally quitted it of his own accord, may settle in a country which he finds without an owner, and there possess an independent domain. Whosoever would afterwards make himself master of the entire country could not do it with justice, without respecting the rights and independence of this person. But if he himself finds a sufficient number of men who are willing to live under his laws, he may, from a new state within the country, or form a new state within the country that he has discovered, and possess there both the domain and the empire." Vattel's outright justification of the colonization of North America, however, is relentless, even if he also justifies the colonization of the land of pastoral Arabs as terra nullius. He tells us, and I quote him again, "The savages of North America had no right to appropriate all that vast continent to themselves, and since they were unable to inhabit the whole of those regions, other nations might without injustice settle in some parts of them, provided they left the natives a sufficiency of land. If the pastoral Arabs would carefully cultivate the soil, a less space might be sufficient for them. Nevertheless, no other nation has a right to narrow their boundaries unless she be under an absolute want of land. For in short, they possess their country, they make use of it after their manner. They reap from it an advantage suitable to their manner of life, respecting which they have no laws to receive from anyone. In a case of pressing necessity, I think people might, without injustice, settle in a part of that country, on teaching the Arabs the means of rendering it, by the cultivation of the earth, sufficient for their own wants and those of the new inhabitants." Historian David Armitage affirms that no writer on the law of nations before Vattel had so consistently and persistently emphasized freedom and independence and interdependence as the condition of states in their relations with one another. Vattel's influence on North American figures who led the 13 colonies to independence was most pronounced. While the first translation of his book into English appeared in 1760, American legal historian Arthur Nussbaum adds that a Swiss publisher in Amsterdam sent 3 copies of a new French edition to Vattel's book to Benjamin Franklin in 1775. Nussbaum claims that the book was previously unknown in America. Franklin informed the Swiss publisher in December 1775 that the book has, quote, "been continuously in the hands of our Congress, now sitting." Vattel's book became a staple textbook at American colleges, and after the establishment of the Republic, the favorite authority in American theory of international law. Armitage, in turn, adds that, quote, "It was no coincidence that the conception of statehood as independence found in the American Declaration of Independence resembled Vattel's so closely, and indeed that the Declaration's vision and wording, quote, owes much to Vattel." The emergence of the term American that was increasingly used in the 1760s by the white settler colonists, replacing the earlier terms of colonists and settlers, is most important in this regard, as it signals a major transformation in the term and its generative power for indigenizing the colonists and the invention of a national identity. It is in this context that Benedict Anderson noted in Imagined Communities that colonial settlers were the progenitors of the concept of national identity and nationalism that would later have worldwide resonance. Most important to stress, however, is that slave owning or not, most important to stress, however, is that notions of freedom, liberty, and independence for the white Protestant male colonists, slave owning or not, essentially meant little more than safeguarding their property, including their slaves, from the encroachment of British taxation, which to them seemed like a form of slavery. Independence for the white Protestant settler colonists, therefore, had centrally an economic sense, with the corresponding political sense ensuring the economic. This would change considerably when less than 2 decades later, independence reached the revolutionary and newly independent Haiti, whose black and colored peoples overthrew colonial slavery and were subjected to an economic siege by the US and Europe and forced to pay indemnities to France. When independence reached Spanish America 4 decades later, the new state's indebtedness to Britain saddled their independence since its inception. In line with this application of independence to non-English speaking colonists, let alone the black and colored former slaves of Saint-Domingue, after World War I and especially World War II, the national independence of non-white peoples became operatively political and anything but economic. It would be left to the English-born white colonial settler Thomas Paine, who arrived in the American colonies in 1774, to elaborate on what he called the doctrine of independence in his mass-circulated pamphlet Common Sense, which he addressed to, quote, the inhabitants of America, unquote, and published in February 1776. Paine defines the term independency, as he called it, as follows. Is the power who is jealous of our prosperity a proper power to govern us? Whoever says no to this question is an independent, where independency means no more than whether we shall make our own laws, or whether the king, the greatest enemy this continent hath, or can have, shall tell us there shall be no laws but such as I like. Paine identifies the enemies of the idea of independence as enemies of settler colonialism. He tells us, ye that oppose independence now, ye know not what ye do. Ye are opening a door to eternal tyranny by keeping vacant the seat of government. There are thousands and tens of thousands who would think it glorious to expel from the continent that barbarous and hellish power which hath stirred up the Indians and the Negroes to destroy us. The cruelty hath a double guilt. It is dealing brutally by us and treacherously by them. Despite his opposition to slavery and recognition of the theft of Native American lands, Paine's understanding of independence was exclusive to the white settlers within the rubric of English-speaking Protestant white supremacy. During the Revolutionary War, the Northern colonists and the British Crown promised black slaves freedom if they joined their respective armies, but tens of thousands of the slaves preferred to support the British, and thousands fought for them. In the case of the rebel southern colonies, Virginia, Georgia, and the Carolinas, well, they promised land and a slave to white men who volunteered to fight in the struggle against the British in the American War of Independence. Independence and settler colonization are intertwined in European, especially in English thought. Daniel Defoe shows us the way. Although as an aesthetic form, the novel makes its first appearance in England in 1719 with Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, this book, or the book is, as Edward Said put it, quote, the prototypical modern realistic novel, and certainly not accidentally, it is about a European who creates a fiefdom for himself on a distant, non-European land. Crusoe, as Said puts it, quote, is the founder of a new world which he rules and reclaims for Christianity and England. Crusoe is explicitly enabled by an ideology of overseas expansion. Defoe's novel is clearly inspired by the work of the Arab Andalusian Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Tufayl, who died in 1185, whose 12th century episode, Hayy bin Yaqdan, had been most recently translated to English by Simon Oakley in 1708, 11 years before Robinson Crusoe was published. Unlike the colonial settler and independence theme of Defoe's novel, Ibn Tufayl's philosophical episode is about a child who awakens on a desert island and only has animals and plants for companionship. Unlike Crusoe, the main character, Hayy, has neither an interest in conquering or possessing the island, nor in territorial expansion, let alone natives to dominate or civilize. There were no natives on the island. Karl Marx saw Crusoe as a symbol of the independent bourgeois settler. Let me quote Marx. Let us now transport ourselves from Robinson's island bathed in light to the European Middle Ages shrouded in darkness. Here, instead of the independent man, we find everyone dependent. Whereas the word independence itself does not make an appearance in Defoe's text, as the term had not yet been in use, it would be James Joyce who would describe Crusoe's and the English colonial settlers' independence best. In his 1912 lecture in Trieste on Defoe, Joyce, speaking in Italian, insisted that, quote, the true symbol of the British conquest is Robinson Crusoe, who, shipwrecked on a lonely island, with a knife and a pipe in his pocket, becomes an architect, a carpenter, a knife grinder, astronomer, baker, shipwright, potter, saddler, farmer, tailor, umbrella maker, and cleric. He is the true prototype of the British colonist, just as Friday, the faithful savage who arrives one ill-starred day, is the symbol of the subject race. All the Anglo-Saxon soul is in Crusoe: virile independence, unthinking cruelty, persistence, slow yet effective intelligence, sexual apathy, practical and well-balanced religiosity, and calculating doubts. The European conquest of islands and enslavement of their natives had already, of course, made an appearance before Robinson Crusoe, most spectacularly in William Shakespeare's The Tempest, whose main Milanese character, Prospero, takes over an island and enslaves its natives. Caliban, whose name, of course, is most likely derived from cannibal, and Ariel. The Martinican surrealist, poet, and playwright Aimé Césaire rewrote the play in 1969 under the French title Une Tempête, which he situates on the island of Haiti. Césaire explicitly identifies Prospero with the white European colonial settler master, Ariel with the colored Haitian who negotiates with the master about the conditions of his enslavement, and Caliban as the black Haitian who rebels against slavery altogether. If Shakespeare's The Tempest has been seen as an allegory of European colonialism, Césaire's rewrite of the play depicts it as an allegory of the struggle for independence from slavery and settler colonialism. Whether in Shakespeare's play or in Defoe's novel, the entrenchment of European ideas about settler colonization, independence, or liberation was evidently formative not only of a key European intellectual and literary aesthetic, but most importantly of political, economic, and cultural projects that juxtapose settler colonial oppression to the lofty ideas of freedom and independence. The legacy of independence would not only be espoused by white French slave-owning Saint-Dominguez or the white Creoles of Spanish America, but also the Dutch settlers of South Africa, black American colonists of West Africa, and by the end of the 19th century, the English and French colonists of Canada, the mixed-race Indish-Dutch colonists of Batavia and Indonesia, not to mention the Anglo-Indians, the Rehoboth pastors of Namibia, the French colons of Algeria, the Zionist Jewish colonists of Palestine, and the British colonists of Rhodesia. They will be joined in the 20th century by the colonized peoples of the world, those living in colonies and in settler colonies, who would use a more recent concept to achieve independence that came to be known as self-determination, to which I now briefly turn. It is often claimed that anti-colonial nationalism and self-determination have a coeval history. Indeed, that self-determination is the principle through which anti-colonialists would achieve independence from colonialism. The story goes that not only have anti-colonialism and self-determination emerged around the same historical juncture, but that the colonial recognition of one automatically leads to the colonial recognition of the other. Yet on closer inspection, this seems to be a misleading narrative. Not only does the dominant form of self-determination seem to be a principle designed to limit the claims of anti-colonial nationalism and to enhance the claims of colonialism, especially the settler-colonial variety and its right of conquest, but even more importantly, colonial and settler-colonial resistance and reticence to recognizing the colonized as nations that deserve independence would only be mitigated once self-determination became the operative criterion by which substantive political, let alone economic independence can be negated. In the case of settler colonialism, the settler colonists would only accede to a recognition that the indigenous peoples whose lands they usurped are nations is the moment self-determination is introduced as a principle or right that not only would not lead to the declared goal of independence from settler colonialism, but rather one that would effectively obstruct it. This can be observed in settler colonies around the globe, from the Americas to Australia, from Palestine and Algeria to Northern Ireland to Rhodesia and South Africa. The colonial settlers fought and mostly preserved their right of conquest as a right of self-determination. The rise of anti-colonial nationalisms in the World War I period forced a major concession on colonizing powers, one that could threaten colonial rule altogether. Coeval with this development, European colonial settlers in Africa and Asia were also looking for an arrangement to limit the authority of the colonial mother country, while at the same time preserve European colonial settler privileges. In the case of the European colonists of Southern Africa, this began since the middle of the 19th century with some success, but was defeated by the British in the Boer Wars. In the case of European Jewish colonists of Palestine, it awaited the end of World War I. French colonists in Algeria, in fact, sought independence in the late 19th century, but failed. A new colonial formula was needed to appease anti-colonial nationalist demands for independence while prolonging colonial and settler colonial rule indefinitely. But as self-determination had emerged in the late 1890s as a socialist principle, and Lenin and the Russian revolutionaries quickly moved to apply it to the non-Russian subjects of the former Russian Empire, Woodrow Wilson hijacked this socialist concept and deployed it at the Paris Peace Conference as a right to be granted only to the colonies of the defeated empires of World War I, but not to those colonized by the victorious empires. Wilson's concept of self-determination, unlike Lenin's, was one that granted political agency not only to the colonized and the defeated empires, but also to the colonizers, and sought to balance the two equally. His explicit aim was to equate the powerful and the powerless, and seemed to posit self-determination as a mask for the right of conquest, rather than its undoing. Wilson's support for the mandate system created the new League of Nations, which created the new League of Nations, was essentially support for a new institutional cover for imperial conquests. This assessment was shared across Europe by the victors, as the post-World War I territorial rearrangements relied on the right of conquest and not on the right of self-determination, primarily in order to prevent the emergence of a German superstate encompassing all the German-speaking populations of Europe. Thus, while the socialist and Leninist pedigree of self-determination was now being co-opted for the purpose of an American and European imperial propaganda war, in reality what triumphed after World War I was a right of conquest through which the territorial spoils of the war were redistributed. Like independence, self-determination in the colonial world was also first demanded by white colonial settlers in South Africa, for example, following the Boer Wars. Here we need to pay special attention to the settler colonies as a model that was also extended to non-settler colonies. It was the South African Jan Smuts who articulated the colonial principle of self-rule for the settlers, who guided the formulation of the ideal of self-determination, later attributed to Woodrow Wilson. The earlier principle of self-rule had been in use by European settler colonists, particularly across the British Empire. But as it did not include the indigenous populations in its purview, it did not acquire the universal appeal that the Wilsonian definition of self-determination would after World War I, primarily due to the latter's application to colonists and natives alike in a move to undermine Lenin's definition. The hegemonic idea that self-determination is some progressive principle that has always had a socialist anti-colonial history which grants the colonized political agency is consequently erroneous, as it ignores how self-determination was imperially co-opted and transformed. Even Hitler and the Nazis, like Wilson and Lloyd George, found self-determination an excellent mask for the right of conquest, which they used to annex territories with German speakers to the Third Reich, most famously Austria and the Sudeten. After World War II, European colonizers and colonists slowly accepted that there was no escape from recognizing that the colonized too were nations and were entitled to self-determination. The strategy followed across settler colonies was as follows: recognize jus soli, or birthright on the land, and jus sanguinis, sort of ethnic groups and cultural linkage, for all colonial settlers to ensure their control of all the land they stole and steal, but concede that the indigenous are nations in the sense of jus sanguinis, meaning they're related by blood and therefore can form a nation, which of course the colonizers and the colonists had previously denied. This would grant the indigenous no more than national, cultural, and identity rights. Simultaneously, the colonizers and the colonists, in keeping with John Locke, de Rattel, Wilson, Lloyd George, and other colonial officials, Lugard comes to mind, would insist on denying the indigenous peoples jus soli to keep their lands in the hands of colonial settlers. This became the operative criterion since the 1960s, both in the specific cases of the settler colonies of Algeria, Kenya, and Zimbabwe, as well as in South Africa, Namibia, and Palestine. But more importantly, it was generalized through the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People issued in 2007. The preamble to UNDRIP, as the acronym goes, states explicitly that, quote, nothing in this declaration may be used to deny any peoples their right to self-determination, exercised in conformity with international law, unquote, which of course could easily apply to colonial settlers, as it often has. The Obama administration, who of course voted against UNDRIP in 2007, decided to accept it in 2010 through affirming Article 46, which ensured that UNDRIP did not threaten territories colonized by European colonial settlers. As such, the declaration has limited the understanding of self-determination in international law further, as one that used to grant the right to independence by transforming this right, when applied to indigenous populations, to self-government and political participation within existing states and not outside their sovereignty. UNDRIP would make it illegal to actually overthrow a colonial settler state. Therein lies the historical and contemporary form of the problem of self-determination and its legal and rhetorical links to anti-colonial nationalism and the quest for independence, but most especially to the settler colonies. The situation of the Palestinians, where the European Jewish colonial settlers continue to rule, instantiates one form, or perhaps functions as one of its many iterations. Think of the Kanaks of New Caledonia, the Catholics of Northern Ireland, the Maoris of New Zealand, Australian Aborigines, the First Peoples of Canada, Native Americans, and Native peoples across Latin America. Yet another form of the problem would be that of Rhodesia, Namibia, and South Africa. In the case of Rhodesia, upon the imminent defeat of the white colonists, the British government undertook to safeguard the settlers' colonially acquired land. The Lancaster Agreement that ended white settler rule tied the hands of post-independence Zimbabwe from initiating land reform in the country for 10 years initially, while the British and the US governments provided funds to compensate white colonists on a willing seller, willing buyer basis, ensuring that jus soli would be preserved for the colonists and denied to Zimbabwe's native black population. This situation was renewed and continued for 2 decades when in 2000, Zimbabwe initiated a forced takeover of white-owned farms without compensation. The Western response to this violation of the right of conquest of white settlers was swift. Sanctions were immediately imposed on Zimbabwe by the US, the UK, and the European Union. In the case of South Africa, once political self-determination was granted to the majority of non-white population in 1994, international economic bodies and instruments took away economic self-determination and limited the new state's sovereign ability to exercise it by insisting that economic decisions related to property remain in the hands of the white colonial settler population, the IMF, and the World Bank. In this case, the interplay between jus soli and jus sanguinis to undo the right to self-determination is camouflaged as an exchange of political rights, which every South African, regardless of race, now has, for economic ones, wherein white South Africans, in alliance with white international capital, possess almost exclusively. Here, self-determination guarantees white colonial settlers' right of conquest of the land and its wealth based on a white supremacist jus sanguinis, as it equalizes them politically with the non-white natives regarding jus soli, while prohibiting the equalized blacks, Indians, and coloreds from using self-determination to claim the landed wealth acquired through the right of conquest. President Trump has just begun to apply sanctions last week on South Africa, falsely accusing it of encroaching on white settlers' property, which actually it did not. But the story of the Palestinians, of black South Africans, Namibians, Zimbabweans, and indigenous peoples in the Americas and Oceania clarifies is that self-determination is not the only route to political and economic independence, but that it is also the legal and rhetorical strategy and the principle that has blocked independence from ever being realized. In short, whereas self-determination led to the political independence of some European states after World War I and of the European colonies in Asia and Africa after World War II, in the settler colonies, self-determination has mostly been and continues to be the enemy of the political and economic goals of independence from settler colonial rule. As ruses of settler colonialism, the principles of independence and self-determination have exclusively served white colonial settlers who deployed them against the non-white colonized and indigenous peoples of the world. And they continue to do so with impunity. Thank you.
Thank you. I have time for questions. You're going to come with the mic. Huh? You're going to be the first?
I don't know, no, let the student, but I'm happy to ask you if no one wants to ask.
As we get students think about their question, you could begin.
Thank you, Jose. This was quite amazing. And, I have many questions, but I will ask only to, I find the work quite generative, and therefore I'd like to think of it more. But for now, I have just one clarifying question and one question. There's something that I might have missed in the middle of the talk, in the transition from independence to self-determination. But I'll return a bit. If Montesquieu separates liberty from independence as a feature of still individuals, not states, and if Vattel brings together, begins to think liberty and independence, and this time independence of states, so the term liberty begins to do work. And I'm asking, because then you have liberation in the middle, transition from independence to self-determination. And I think this is where I lost what you said about liberation. And so a clarifying point then about liberation also in relation to liberty, right? Not only in relation to national, there are many genealogies to liberation as well, but also in relation to that genealogy of liberty that you point out in Vattel. So that's the first clarifying question. And the second, and that's just something that I'm thinking about, but you may have different thoughts here. Might it be because liberation has not been legally codified in any way, that is, independence has become a legal text of the Declaration of Independence, so there is juridification of independence, self-determination too in international law, and in the practice of international law, as you say. And for the students who don't know, you've published a wonderful piece on self-determination in the journal Humanity. But some of this work is already anticipated there and is done there if you want to read it and not wait until the book is out. So might it be that liberation does different work precisely because it does not have the legal the legal writing, or maybe not. Maybe its philosophical background with liberty and possession and property is already taming it. So your thoughts on that?
Thank you. Like independence and self-determination, liberation is also a colonial settler term. It was first used by Pope Urban when he began the first crusade against Palestine. And Palestine became the location of the first European settler colony outside of Europe. So of course the liberation of Jerusalem from the Muslim heathens was actually, he said, Jerusalem is calling for us to liberate us from the heathens, and its liberation is now imperative on good Christians. So the term liberation is equally linked to settler colonialism, perhaps to the first move, the Catholic settler colonial crusader campaign, the first crusade, where it becomes very, very important. Now, of course, liberation, aside from this Christian notion of liberation of the land of course, of the Christians. And remember, of course, it was the Crusaders who bestowed the strange name on Palestine, calling it the Holy Land, right? It was never called the Holy Land before. Some people think because there was one mention of Palestine as a Holy Land in the Quran, that also Muslims refer to it as such. Of course, that's not the case. Holy Land only replaced in the Catholic lexicon the Promised Land, which was, of course, also in the biblical term. But Holy Land itself was invented by the Crusaders. So liberation comes back to us in the 19th century to mean a number of things, right? National liberation, not just liberation, becomes a new term. They're juxtaposed together by the late 19th century and begin to operate probably after the 1860s and 1870s and begin to be used differently from other forms of liberation. After all, we had sexual liberation and gender liberation and all kinds of liberations. So national liberation does become a new notion philosophically in the late 19th century. Again, from foreign occupiers, right? I mean, Marx uses it in relation to Hungary and Poland. The Greeks begin to use it in their quest for independence and the war on Muslims and Turks as Muslims, as a holy war of Christians against Muslims. But also the Greeks borrow the term independence, a new term. They craft one in Greek, in modern Greek, which didn't exist before, and therefore becomes sort of a new notion. But remember, in the case of Greece, it's usually called the revolution, less so independence. But by the time you get to the late 19th century, national liberation has become an important, let's say, signal. Certainly by the 1930s, you have the Chinese Red Army, it's called, of course, Army of Liberation. Small Palestinian Communist Party also calls for national liberation, etc. So you begin to have names of these sorts operating. But they operate within and around these notions of independence and self-determination in a certain way, even if the wars of national liberation become also synonymized with wars of independence and things of that sort. I mean, remember, it's very interesting. The so-called American Declaration of Independence was never called that. Until today, it's not even called that formally, right? The so-called Israeli Declaration of Independence has never been called that. It's called the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel. So the term Declaration of Independence are ex post facto invented terms. I mean, the American Independence Day doesn't even become a holiday till the late 19th century, and not a paid holiday till the 1930s. So this idea is very interesting to think about how independence comes to be ideologized in a certain way, while liberation itself, in many ways becomes a synonym, but is not legally integrated in juridical parlance. It's politically very interesting to see how liberation starts from a settler-colonial project. I mean, in that sense, Palestine becomes, unfortunately, the first and the last European settler colony. I mean, it's even set up before Ireland. Right? Even Engels usually calls Ireland the first English colony, and it was. But of course, the first, crusader or European colony of the French, English, Spanish, and Italians was Palestine. So it's an interesting sort of juxtaposition. I hope that gives you some indication.
Thank you so much. There were just so much enlightening points and concepts that you introduced us. The question of right to self-determination still puzzles me, in the sense that it has been historically and legally used to justify the rule, political and economic rule of the settler colonial powers in various places. What I'm wondering about is, how is it that Israel does not use that term in order to justify its right to Palestine? Instead, it goes to a biblical myth, actually, to basically exert its right to the territories of Palestine. Is it because self-determination in the minds of lay people has a different notion and is unacceptable to use it, although legally they can use it? So, yeah.
Thank you for the question. Actually, Israel does, but you're right, not always. For example, the Balfour Declaration, or the mandate itself, for example, or even the Declaration of the State of Israel, does not mention the right to self-determination. So it's very interesting, its absence from that. But there are statements by Zionist leaders from the 30s, for example, which would speak about the self-determination of Jews should not contradict the self-determination of Palestinians, or both have self-determination, but the Jews have a superior one. They often claim. I'm quoting Ben Gurion, for example. But of course, self-determination would become an important issue, first of all, to begin to recognize the nationness of Palestinians and self-determination in the 70s. Amazingly enough, it begins to be used actually by Begin initially, and where he speaks of the Palestinian people and sometimes Palestinian peoples in the Camp David Accords. It's unclear. Peoples, usually what he wants to say is that they're separate people who call themselves Palestinians who may not be the same. But then, by the 90s, suddenly the Palestinians are recognized as a people and as a nation, which means the Israelis have no problem if these Palestinians decide that they have dishes that are the same, like to dance dabke and things of that sort. But none of this should in any way mean that they should have rights to the land. It's one thing to have youth ceremonies, that they want to be a people who are we to say no. We used to say no, but now we can say yes, but that doesn't mean, and so self-determination simply means that. So Native Americans can keep their cultural rights, can keep their practices, can be enshrined in law. That doesn't mean they can in any way recuperate the lands that have been taken away. Now, in the meantime, the Israelis began to speak much more urgently about self-determination. This became important in 2018. The Israelis issued a new law called the nation-state law. There are 3 settler colonies today where the demographic problem is very threatening to the settlers. They had initially managed, the white European settlers had managed to basically overpower the native populations of Northern Ireland, of New Caledonia, and Palestine through expulsion, through genocide, and through bringing more and more settlers. By the 21st century, Protestants in Northern Ireland were no longer a majority. The Catholics were becoming larger. In New Caledonia, the French government every year now continues to make it easier and bring all kinds of economic attractions for white settlers to continue to go to New Caledonia to overpower the Canucks, who are becoming over 40% of the population after they were decimated. And of course, the Palestinians, from the beginning of the 21st century, have become a majority in all the areas that Israel rules. As a result of this demographic issue, the Israelis realized that the kind of liberal attempt, which copies the US attempt, of giving democratic rights to the colonized, to parts of the colonized, is going to backfire. As you know, for example, the United States colonized, let's say, New Mexico in 1848, and began to introduce what subsequently was called Anglo-settlers until 1912. In 1912, you have a majority of white settlers in New Mexico. It becomes a state, because now the white settlers can actually outvote, and you can't be accused of outright racism or apartheid. The Israelis in 2018 realized that, in fact, if they're unable to correct this demographic imbalance, or as the Israeli dovish leader Shimon Peres used to say, the Palestinian demographic bomb, as he called it, then we will lose. So as a result, they crafted a new law which said only Jews have the exclusive right of self-determination in Israel and in Palestine. So, what means that if Palestinians become 90% of the population, it doesn't matter. Now, Jews explicitly have a special, exclusive right of self-determination. So these 3 locations are very important today, because in the other settler colonies, after the annihilation of the majority of the native population, and the white settlers and their descendants are assured that, even if granting all kinds of rights to the indigenous population, it won't be threatening. But it is very threatening in Northern Ireland, which is why we see the Friday Agreement has not resolved anything in the last 25 years or 30 years. New Caledonia was up in arms a few months ago as a result of the attempt to bring in more white settlers who, as civil servants, are paid triple what they would be paid in France. So this is why they are brought to act as economic incentives, and in Palestine. And of course, the attempt to demographically reduce the Palestinians in the latest war is not very much far from this calculation as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dr. Massad. Sorry.
I can't see you. Oh, there you go.
Oh, here. Thank you, Dr. Massad, for such wonderful and profound talk. I'm thinking about, you brought up in your lecture the work of Anthony Angie.
Yes.
And it sounds to me like your work and his resonate well together. And in the same way, in your examination of the making of the concept of independence and self-determinism, it also sheds light to his work on international law and the origins of it.
Kant wanted to call it intrastatal, but they decided on international as the term of choice. So it's kind of interesting that way.
No, but absolutely. One of the points you brought up, the law of the nations and the jurisprudence of Victoria, right? And one of the because part of what I'm saying that I see the resonance is that fundamentally you're trying to tell us that these concepts that we think are liberating us are in a way also are structurally meant there to repress us. So part of the work of Victoria is to come and bring the jurisprudence of the new law of nation based on reason, right? And instead of the universal right of the Pope. So now all, when it comes to the Native Americans are also, as he writes, people endowed with reason, so they have some rights. But specifically because they are endowed with reason, then they cannot block the passage of other rational people. And if they are to block the entry of other rational people into the city, then they de facto declare war, and by that they rationalize the whole annexation of Native America and all of that under the new jurisprudence of reason, the new jurisprudence of the independence of the law of the civilized nations and all of that. So, and it's exactly the kind of, which seems to be retracing the same kind of development. And my question is fundamentally, especially that you brought up the question of economic self-determinism. And I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a bit more on how specifically within the context, say, for instance, of the Arab world, and you know, of the drawing of the nation-state model there, speak on all of that. How is the political, or how is the making of political self-determinism specifically working to block economic self-determinism? Political self-determinism under the nation-state model. Specifically, if we are thinking about mid-century pan-Arabist projects of other forms of economic cooperation, that is, while the political model of self-determinism under the nation-state model is one of the obstacles in a way of a true economic self-determinism in these countries that have been before colonized. So if you could, you know, that kind of a reversal between what he's politically doing the work of liberation, but structurally he's really doing the work of domination it's interesting, and if you could extend it to the economy.
Thank you. Of course, it's not just the Arab world, it's just the entire sort of formerly colonized world. Of course, Kwame Nkrumah had written a book and coined the term neo-colonialism to describe the independence of former colonies as actually not really independence at all, right? This is the whole idea of the economic dependence, that basically the colonizing world refused to change any of the economic arrangements that existed under colonialism after the end of colonialism. So really only the political arrangements changed and the economic ones did not. I mean, remember, there were many successful attempts at reversing settler colonialism, if by that we mean the end of settler colonial economic and land rights within the country. Perhaps the first and the most violent was Haiti, or Saint-Domingue, right? Where the white settlers were massacred. And of course, those who survived fled with their slaves to the white supremacist neighbor to the north, the United States, which was, of course, waiting for them with open arms to receive them. On the other hand, then you get another violent attempt by the Poles, right? Poland's independence after World War I ends with the massive expulsion of German settlers, both the ones that had lived there for hundreds of years and the recent ones that have been brought by Bismarck since the 1870s through the end of World War I. Of course, Hitler would use that expulsion of the German settlers as also a casus belli in 1939 when he invaded Poland on September 1st. The Soviets, of course, were the ones who immediately reversed settler colonialism across Russia. Immediately, the settlers, the Russian settlers in Central Asia, in Siberia, and the Caucasus, all their settler privileges were taken away. Immediately, lands were returned that had been given by the Tsar. Recently, settlers were taken back and given to the native population. And of course, by 1929, the land was no longer an issue after collectivization, where there were no longer private property. So it was, the reversal was quite effective in that sense. And of course, the Soviet Union insisted on independent republics and autonomous republics and what have you. And there were immediate purges, even in the Soviet Academy in the 20s, sometimes seen as repressive. If we now knew some new histories of that period of Soviet history, tells us that, for example, the Anthropological Academic Association was purged by the Soviet government because it continued to be dominated by white Russian professors who refused to actually integrate people from the native republics in there, which is why it was actually purged, and many of them replaced by new anthropologists who are brown and Muslim and from all over the Soviet Union. Remember, of course, even and the Soviet Union was more than 83% European population-wise, between the Ukrainians and the Belarusians and the Russians. But still, everybody else had, so there was an effective reversal of settler colonization. Then after World War II, we see this, of course, happening in places like Tunisia and Algeria. Algeria perhaps was the most effective in refusing to compensate the settlers for their ill-gotten property. They did offer the settlers equality. And as you know, for the settlers, equality is worse than death. So they refused. They all wanted to go back to France where white supremacy was guaranteed. In Tunisia as well, but there were arrangements to compensate them by the Tunisian government at the time, which was more of the right-wing part of the national liberation movement. In Morocco, you ended up also having less loss of property at all, where the property was guaranteed. Libya is where they were given finally the possibility under Muammar Gaddafi. Either they get Libyan citizenship and they maintain their property, or all of their property would be confiscated. They refused Libyan nationality and left to Italy. And of course, all their property was nationalized by the Libyans at the time. Now, Kenya was very interesting. Kenya became really the model. When the Kenyan white colonists refused to actually go, the British and the Americans ensured that they would actually get full compensation by the Kenyan post-independence government for any land that they would lose, if anything, that they could sell it at the better prices, they can demand whatever prices they want, and they got away with it. They tried to do this in Zimbabwe, which went for 20 years, and finally they were most successful in replicating the Kenyan example in Namibia and South Africa. In Namibia, until today, they actually forced the post-independence government after 1990 to make sure that in the constitution, it cannot take over any of the lands. The majority of the lands in Namibia continue to be owned by 5,000 German settlers, most of whom live in Germany. And any attempt by the Namibian government to take over their land had been blocked by the courts, based on the constitution forced upon them when the Soviet Union fell and when the US insisted that any constitution that is adopted would preserve the ill-gotten property of the white settlers. South Africa, I mentioned. Now, in terms of economic versus political independence, I think the Arab world is not unlike the rest of the third world. It's exactly in the same place as far as, although perhaps it has less political independence than they do, and of course, no economic independence.
Thank you for today's talk. I was just wondering, to follow up on your discussion, that the concept of self-determination is sort of intellectualizing a justification that to an unjust reality, and that international mechanisms have failed to deliver results or liberation, quote-unquote, to settler colonies. So I was wondering, what relevance do these, quote-unquote, rights continue to have in modern discourse? You see a lot of work in the Palestinian movement to try to seek liberation or what have you through these international mechanisms. But at every attempt, either these mechanisms conspire to deny the Palestinians liberation, or you have the world powers like the US intervening to stop these processes from taking place. So if in the end, the only successful examples we have is the likes of Algeria, which was a violent war, what relevance do these rights continue to hold in modern discourse? And in the end, is might right in settling these rights?
Thank you. Well, listen, I mean, the Palestinians, since the Balfour Declaration, were demanding independence, right? All the documents that were sent by Palestinian nationalists to the Paris Conference in 1919 and in 1920, 1918 and 19 were all demanding independence, right? And this continued to be the discourse, including national liberation, which would become an important notion. That would, of course, become the name of the PLO, right? The Palestine Liberation Organization. The idea of demanding a state only would begin in the 70s, where they no longer spoke of independence. This is a Zionist demand. The Zionists are the ones who always demanded a state. So it's very strange that the Palestinian group that wants independence suddenly, or the national liberation, would begin to demand a state and not independence. So as you see, sort of the Palestinian Authority still speaks in the language of states, still thinks that terms like self-determination have any legal meanings that will somehow end settler colonialism, which it won't. I mean, even if self-determination is applied to Palestine today, this would not mean at all any decolonization. It would not mean the end of any of the settler colonies, even in the West Bank, or let alone in East Jerusalem. So there is, I don't think those who use it at the level of the leadership misunderstand. They know exactly what it means. And the Israelis continue to say it. And the Zionists have been saying this since Haim Weizmann in the 20s, right? The idea that we have no problem allowing the Palestinians to have authority over the schools, although actually now they do, they want to decide the curriculum. But I mean, he said over the schools or over their charitable organizations or religious institutions, we can grant them that, but nothing more than that. And the Israelis have been true to these principles, in fact. They haven't really moved away from those. They continue to say, we're happy to give them some control over their sewage system and whatever bus system. But that's pretty much it. This is assuming there's no colonization. Now, of course, they're retracting from that. But Palestinian groups who insist on questions of self-determination without independence and national liberation, I think understand very well. And if they don't understand, that's even more calamitous, right? But of course, self-determination continues to be marketed as if it's a good for the unfamiliar, right, with this term. So, yes, so, so the issue is not that. The issue, of course, what many people who are in solidarity with Palestinians have always demanded is exactly what the Algerians have offered to the settlers: equality, right? That all of this will end if you accept to be equals. And the Zionist settlers in Palestine are no different from the French settlers in Algeria or Tunisia or Rhodesia. Equality for them is actually a fate worse than death. I mean, remember, the Zionists, this is what I tried to do today also, is to show that Israel is not an exception. It's actually part of it. There's nothing exceptional, right? And I mean, they get all of the ideas. After all, the idea that the Zionists posited, and this also addresses some of your question, that that European Jews were returning to Palestine, this was not a Zionist empire from which they came, that in fact the Arabs of these regions are the colonists, and they were in fact returning. They were the indigenous population of North Africa. I mean, remember, Libya, in fact, is a Roman name that means nothing to the local people. It's unfortunate that subsequent to independence, the people of so-called Libya accepted to use this ancient Greek Roman name of the country. The idea that allegedly the Palestinians or the Arabs want to throw the Jews in the sea is not a Zionist invention. This is what the Portuguese actually claimed the Africans wanted to do to them in Angola and in Mozambique, that they wanted to throw them in the sea. So when Weizmann begins to use this, when he says, when the Palestinians demand a legislative council and equal rights, what they want to do with that is to throw us in the sea. He's actually quoting the Portuguese. So none of the, I mean, one of the interesting things about the Zionists is that they lack often all originality. Everything they actually do is just a repetition of what other colonists have done. And I do strive to deprive them of exceptionalism. I don't think they're exceptional. They're actually just like all other colonists. And the situation is not this simple.
Any last question? Take one last question.
Sure.
I have a question. I'm a little confused on why is it that the Western countries are helping the Israeli colony? Why is it, how are they invested? It's not their own colonies. Why are they protecting for example?
Okay. Why wouldn't they? I mean, why wouldn't the I mean, listen, the Americans continue to support the French in New Caledonia. They continue to support the British in Northern Ireland. They continue to support the white Australians' policy vis-a-vis the Aborigines. They themselves are a settler colony that continue to deprive Native Americans of their rights. It's not true. Sometimes when I speak in Europe or when some pro-Palestine activists come to me and say, but why do all these countries object to dictatorial or undemocratic practices in all countries but not in Israel? It's not true. When have you heard the US or Britain complain about the treatment of the Maoris or the First Nations of Canada? When have you heard France or Spain complain about the treatment of Black Namibians or Kenyans during the settler-colonialism there? Not at all. In fact, it's the same attitude. The Palestinians, as much as they would like to be an exception to this rule, are not, in fact. And the lack of attention to their struggle for national liberation or against settler-colonialism is not unlike that all other natives continue to labor under by all these liberal states who claim to stand for freedom as independence or liberty as self-determination. I don't think there's a difference. In fact, why wouldn't they? Israel, in many ways, of course, is a part of a U.S. project, right? It's not the war, and if anyone still had any doubts that what the Palestinians were fighting were actually the U.S. and not Israel, I think the last war perhaps made it clear. The Israelis are granted the right to do whatever they would like in turn. But all foreign policy, all war decisions, they cannot decide on their own. They cannot invade or attack Iran or Syria or Lebanon without U.S. prior approval, if not the U.S. actually asking them to do this. All they can do within Israel, they have carte blanche to do what they want within the settlement. But as for the regional situation, they are completely operating under U.S. dicta. They don't have the freedom to move about. And as you can see from the first moment of this war, within 24 hours, the Europeans and the Americans realized that the Israelis won't be able to defend themselves on their own. And they dispatched, of course, Navy ships and all the sort of armaments of the West to make sure that Israel remained protected. And they would do the same for any other settler colony. It's nothing special.
Why? Why are they helping each other out?
Well, like I said, this is the international order of white supremacy and of imperialism. So there's an economic order of racialized capitalism. There's the larger question of settler colonialism, as I began my talk today, was really about the economic benefits for a group of settlers, right, who believe that they should have a right to economic independence and economic prosperity at the expense of others. And that continues to be, I'm simplifying, but this was indeed the first idea of independence was not, after all, white Americans were only upset when the British began to stop them from expanding their colonization beyond Appalachia, right? This is, and the encroachment on more Native American land, and they began to send them back. That was actually one of the main, or one of the principal factors that led to the American Revolution. Of course, taxation was part of that as well.
Maybe I could ask you just, at the end you spoke about Trump in relations to South Africa. What is at play with Trump, Elon Musk, using South Africa right now relative to whites in the domestic discourse in the United States, and what is it being? What are they trying to achieve?
Well, it's part of the attack on affirmative action, the attack on the liberal notions of diversity and what have you. The idea that white people are actually the victims of this, right? So, and Trump, and of course, the Democrats have been the same. After all, the racist discourse of privileging, allegedly privileging racial minorities in the U.S. has been with us in the media under the Democrats, as much as under the Republicans. So I think it's an extension of that, right? If the anti-apartheid movement in this country used the civil rights movement as an example, that South Africa, and of course, it was the same situation ultimately, as in the civil rights movement did not lead to the liberation of African Americans from economic apartheid. It ended political apartheid as a price of maintaining the poverty and the exploitation of African Americans, just as South Africa had done. So the idea now is that white people are oppressed everywhere in the world, and this is of course marketed to the white poor in the US, that it's not the white rich who actually are the reason for their poverty. It is, horrible brown and black immigrants or affirmative action and what have you. So I think it does channel that kind of discourse.
Any questions?
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.